I knew the day was going to be a disaster the moment I stepped outside and saw a giant pink and purple party tent blocking my entire driveway, like some kind of circus had crash-landed on my property overnight, because the sun had barely risen and the sprinklers had not even turned on yet, but there it was towering over my car like a fabric monster, daring me to react, and the moment that froze me was hearing Karen scream from inside the tent at 6 in the morning, yelling, "Don't touch anything, this driveway is for my daughter's celebration today," as if she owned the concrete I paid for. And at that moment I realized today was not just a normal entitled neighbor incident. This was war, but a war wrapped in glitter balloons and cheap folding tables, and I stood there staring with the kind of disbelief that makes you question whether someone is pranking you or whether the neighborhood has officially gone insane, because I could not even reach my garage, let alone reverse my car, and the air smelled like frosting and plastic, which was strange because no cake was visible anywhere, and before I could even clear my throat, Karen stormed out of the tent in her robe, slippers, hair wrapped in curlers, holding a clipboard like she was directing a film set, and she jabbed the air toward me with the confidence of a dictator, announcing a new law proclaiming that the driveway needed to remain blocked from sunrise to sunset because her angel was turning 12 and deserved a magical experience. And I stared at her, waiting for the punchline, but instead she started adjusting decorations on my property while humming off-key and acting like I was the intruder on my own land, and that was when the first real twist hit me, because I noticed small holes in my lawn where her metal tent stakes had been hammered in, meaning she had trespassed deep into my yard while I slept, and the anger that rose inside me was not loud but cold and focused, like a spark that finds dry wood and begins to spread. Because this woman had tested limits before, but nothing like this, and I took a breath, trying to remain calm, asking her why she thought it was acceptable to block my driveway without permission, and she replied with that trademark smug grin that made neighbors want to scream, saying that the community spirit clause meant we all needed to support local events, especially children events, and that refusing her would make me look heartless in front of the neighborhood. And I almost laughed, because the so-called community spirit clause was not a real rule at all. It was something she invented years ago to justify borrowing people's garden tools without returning them, and using other people's trash bins when hers overflowed, and hosting her backyard Zumba classes despite noise complaints. But before I could correct her, she snapped her fingers and summoned 2 kids, who were dragging more decorations toward my mailbox, and I realized she was fully committed to her delusion before sunrise even hit its stride. And while she directed them like they were stagehands, I pulled out my phone and recorded everything silently, because experience had taught me that dealing with Karen required evidence, lots of evidence, and she noticed me filming and let out an exaggerated gasp, claiming I was invading her privacy on my own driveway, which made no sense, but logic never survives contact with her, and she marched up to me so close I could smell the hairspray cloud around her, and she started lecturing me about being a supportive neighbor and how her daughter needed this party to be perfect because her daughter's social life depended on it, and she said the word social like it was a national emergency, and I tried once again to calmly explain that blocking a person's driveway was not only rude but illegal, and she waved her clipboard like a magic wand, telling me she already informed some of the neighbors and they agreed it was fine, and that if I had somewhere important to go I should just adjust my plans for one day. And that sentence hit me harder than expected, because I did have somewhere important to go, a morning appointment at the mechanic for my truck, which I had been waiting weeks for, and rescheduling would push it into next month. And I mentioned this to her, and she said, "Well, you should have told me earlier," as if I should have predicted that she would erect a circus tent while the sky was still dark. And that was the moment something inside me clicked, not rage, not panic, but a very calm, strategic part of my brain that knew exactly what to do, because while Karen believed she was preparing for the biggest neighborhood event of the month, I remembered something she clearly did not know. My lawn sprinklers were on a programmable schedule, and they covered my driveway from 3 angles with enough water pressure to soak a small elephant. And as she continued barking orders to the kids and dragging more folding chairs out of her minivan, which was illegally parked on the sidewalk by the I walked over to my sprinkler control box and checked the schedule, smiling quietly because today they were set to start at 6 in the morning, exactly 25 minutes from now, and I did not even need to change anything. The universe had already set the stage for me, and I watched Karen proudly adjusting the fabric walls of the tent, smoothing them like she was preparing a royal pavilion, unaware that every stake, every balloon, every streamer was about to experience a dawn they would never forget. And while she shouted at the kids for misplacing a pack of plastic cups, I stepped back, surveyed the scene, and felt the rare peaceful joy of knowing natural justice was coming on time, triggered automatically, without me lifting a finger. And the best part was she could not blame me because the sprinklers had been scheduled that way for years, and every neighbor knew it, and the footage I recorded already showed her trespassing and hammering stake into my lawn hours before sunrise. So as the minutes ticked down and the light crept slowly over the houses, I leaned against my mailbox, sipping the last of my cold coffee, watching Karen celebrate her temporary victory, while having no idea it was about to all collapse, literally and figuratively, the moment 6 o'clock arrived. And as the clock approached the final minute, I could not help but grin, because sometimes karma does not need planning, it just needs a sprinkler system, a stubborn neighbor, and a driveway full of decorations ready to be baptized by cold water. The moment the clock struck 6, it was almost cinematic, because the sprinklers fired up with a sharp hiss that sliced through the quiet morning, and within seconds 3 powerful arcs of cold water blasted directly into the side of the massive tent, sending a ripple through the fabric like a sail caught in a storm, and the sound alone made Karen jolt upright from where she had been adjusting a stack of balloons, and her shriek was so loud it startled a flock of birds off the power line as she stumbled backward, waving her arms as if the water was acid instead of simple tap water. But the real chaos began when the tent walls absorbed the water, and then sagged inward, warping like a deflating bouncy castle, while the decorations started collapsing under the pressure, and I stood at the edge of my driveway pretending to be shocked, while inside I was fighting the urge to laugh, because the scene unfolding was pure slapstick gold. And Karen dashed back and forth screaming, "Stop, stop, stop, turn it off," as though she owned the timers, and I patiently reminded her these sprinklers are scheduled, and I told you yesterday the water line was being tested, which was a lie, but a harmless one, since she never listens to anything unless it benefits her, and she kept slipping on the wet concrete while trying to pull the tent stakes out, but the stakes were dug deep into my lawn, meaning she had to yank with both hands while water sprayed directly into her face, and her slippers squelched with every step, and the curlers in her hair were drooping like wet noodles, while the kids who had been setting up cups and plates began running around screaming, because water was splashing into the cardboard boxes and soaking everything, and one kid ran straight into a sprinkler arc and was thrown backward by the sudden blast, which sent plastic utensils flying everywhere like confetti, while Karen shrieked at him not to cry because he was making the situation worse, which made no sense, but Karen logic rarely does. And as the tent poles began to weaken from the water pressure, the whole structure started tilting to one side, and Karen tried to hold it up like she was some kind of superhero, but the fabric was heavy now, soaked through like a drenched blanket, and she was too small to fight gravity, and she yelled at me again, insisting that I must have changed the sprinkler schedule on purpose, and I calmly replied that, if she had checked with me before trespassing, maybe we could have avoided this. And that sentence made her freeze for a second, because she realized I said trespassing aloud, and that meant she knew I had evidence of her hammering stakes in my yard, and her eyes widened slightly in fear before she quickly masked it behind more screaming, and she ran to her minivan, grabbed what looked like a rain jacket, and threw it over her head, which did absolutely nothing as the water soaked through instantly. And while she battled with the tent, I noticed the neighbors starting to come out in pajamas, robes, and morning coffee mugs, watching with bewildered fascination as the entire driveway turned into a flooded comedy stage, and Mrs. Harper from across the street whispered loudly so everyone could hear that she warned Karen not to block my driveway, but Karen told her it was none of her business, and Mr. Willis laughed into his coffee saying this is better than TV, and I felt a little sorry for the kids who were now scooping water out of plastic bins, trying to salvage soggy cupcakes that Looked like melted pastel blobs, but Karen kept shouting at them to save the decorations, save the balloons, save everything, which was impossible because the balloons were already popping one by one when the cold water hit them, and the loud pops echoed against the houses like firecrackers, and Karen shrieked every time one burst as if she were taking physical damage from each pop. And then came the biggest moment of the chaos when the main pole of the tent finally buckled under the weight of the waterlogged fabric, and the entire tent collapsed forward onto Karen's lawn chair display, sending her sprawling to the ground with a dramatic wail and a splash, and the neighbors gasped, not out of concern but amazement, because the collapse looked like a slow-motion disaster in a movie, and Karen rolled over coughing and sputtering, while her hair curlers fell off one by one and drifted across the driveway like tiny colorful boats, and I walked over, calmly offering her a towel which she slapped out of my hand, accusing me of sabotaging her daughter's special day, and threatening to call the HOA president and the sheriff, and maybe even her lawyer, and I casually reminded her that everything happening was the direct consequence of her putting a tent on property that was not hers and ignoring every warning given, and she glared at me with the fury of a soaked, angry cat, trying to maintain dignity, but failing, and she stood up wobbling slightly as water dripped from every part of her robe, and she stomped toward her tent poles trying to lift them, but they were too heavy now, and the kids surrounded her looking helpless and embarrassed, and she barked orders again, telling them to pick up decorations, but everything was either soaked, shredded, or floating, and the neighbors chuckled quietly while pretending not to, and I knew that this embarrassment alone would not stop her, because Karen never retreats, she reloads, and sure enough she whipped out her phone and started dialing frantically, pacing the wet concrete while shouting into the receiver about property damage, malicious intent, harassment, and emotional trauma, and I leaned on my fence trying not to laugh, because I knew every word she said could be disproven by the video I recorded earlier, and as she continued ranting I caught the eye of the HOA president, Mr. Dalton, who had walked over in slippers and a cup of tea, shaking his head, as if he had been awakened too many times by Karen nonsense over the years, and he asked me quietly what happened, and I explained everything while showing him the footage on my phone, and the man groaned into his tea, saying she is going to try to weaponize the rules again, but this time she has no ground to stand on, and that was when Karen marched toward us dripping wet, announcing that she had already contacted the HOA emergency line and the sheriff, and she would make sure I paid for every bit of damage, and for ruining her daughter's birthday, and she pointed at me with a trembling, soaked finger and declared, "You messed with the wrong mother," and just then one of the sprinklers rotated slightly and blasted her directly in the face, knocking her backward again, which caused the entire group of neighbors to burst into laughter. They pretended to hide behind their coffee cups, but their shoulders were shaking, and Karen screamed in frustration, kicking the sprinkler, which only caused it to spray more wildly and drench her even further, and as she stomped away, slipping and cursing under her breath, I knew the situation was far from over, because Karen had two modes, petty and nuclear, and after her driveway circus collapsed in front of half the neighborhood, she was definitely switching to nuclear. After the sprinklers finally shut off on their own, the neighborhood gathered in a loose semicircle, watching the aftermath like spectators at the end of a chaotic parade, while Karen stomped around her collapsed tent, still dripping and enraged, and muttering about lawsuits and damages, and how her daughter's entire social reputation had been destroyed before breakfast, which did not make much sense, but she said it with such dramatic despair that even the kids looked confused and unsure whether they should comfort her or just quietly back away, and I was about to return inside to change clothes when Karen suddenly froze mid-rant as if struck by a revelation, and her face scrunched into a twisted grin that only meant one thing: she was about to escalate, and escalate fast, because she turned to the HOA president, Mr. Dalton, and began proclaiming loudly that I had intentionally assaulted her property, hosted a dangerous sprinkler attack, and caused emotional harm to her daughter, who was still asleep. and completely unaware of anything happening, and she insisted that the HOA must fine me immediately, suspend my yard privileges, whatever that meant, and force me to pay for replacement equipment, decorations, and even a backup party package. She wanted to order now that everything was ruined, and Mr. Dalton looked at her the way a tired teacher looks at a student who keeps failing the same test because he had seen her theatrics too many times, and he calmly reminded her that I owned my driveway, I owned my lawn, and she had no right to put a tent on my property without written permission, and she tried to wave this off, saying that everyone knew she was planning the party, which was a lie because apparently even her husband did not know and had gone on an overnight fishing trip 3 hours away, and then she shifted tactics, saying that there was a community spirit rule that allowed for shared spaces, and both I and Dalton simultaneously said no such rule exists, which made her blink rapidly like someone rebooting, and then she demanded that we call the vice president of the HOA, who in her mind always agreed with her but in reality usually avoided her completely, and as she fumbled with her phone again, Dalton asked me in a low voice if I still had the footage, and I nodded and handed him my phone, and he watched silently, shaking his head. At the moment she hammered the stakes into my grass and muttered something like, "This is textbook trespassing and sabotage of private property," and when he glanced back at Karen, his expression was almost apologetic in advance because he knew this was about to get messy, and sure enough Karen decided to broaden her campaign by marching house to house trying to gather support for her claim that I had ruined her daughter's birthday, and that the neighborhood should unite against me, and she started knocking on doors, dripping water onto welcome mats, leaving soggy footprints everywhere, and demanding that each neighbor sign an emergency statement against me. But every house she visited either turned her away or quietly told her that she was completely in the wrong, and more than one person mentioned that the sprinklers fiasco was the funniest thing they had ever seen at dawn, which only enraged her more, and by the time she reached the fourth house her wet robe had started sticking to her legs, and her mascara had smudged into raccoon patterns, and she looked more like a distressed backstage performer than a neighborhood authority. And meanwhile the kids she had dragged along earlier were now standing near the remains of the tent, poking the soggy structure with sticks, and whispering about how maybe the tent could still be saved, which was technically true if you considered saving to include cutting it into strips and using it as makeshift tarps, but Karen was too busy spiraling to notice, and when she came storming back toward me her voice cracked from shouting as she announced that fine if the neighbors would not support her, then she would take the matter directly to law enforcement and get a formal police report filed against me, and she stomped toward her minivan, which had not survived the sprinkler blast either because the decals she had taped to it "Happy Birthday Princess" were peeling off like sad wet stickers, and the windows were fogged from the moisture, and she threw open the driver's door, nearly slipping again before climbing inside and starting the engine, and I genuinely thought she was leaving, but instead she rolled down the window and yelled through it that she was going to get the sheriff to force me to pay for every penny, and for emotional damages and potential medical trauma she might claim later, and she screeched away from the curb, leaving a watery trail behind her like a slug, but louder and more dramatic, and as the noise faded down the street the neighbors slowly dispersed, laughing, whispering, and shaking their heads, marveling at the spectacle they had just witnessed, and some asked me what I planned to do next. But honestly I was not sure, because dealing with Karen always felt like trying to predict the direction of a tornado. You can guess but you never really know, and while I began gathering the broken tent poles and scattered decorations into a pile at the edge of my driveway, both as a courtesy and as a way to document how badly the scene had been destroyed, I noticed something that made me pause, because inside one of the soggy cardboard boxes was a large rented speaker with a tag that clearly said, "Property of Megasonic Events Rental Company," and I realized Karen had not only trespassed but she had damaged rented equipment that would definitely not be cheap to replace, and I pictured her trying to explain to the rental company how a sprinkler monsoon toppled the speaker, and how it was totally not her fault, and the image alone made me snort out a laugh, and after a moment I carried the speaker to my porch to let it dry a little and took more photos of the tent wreckage for evidence, because Experience taught me that the more documentation the better, especially when Karen was involved, and just as I finished taking pictures I noticed a text message from an unknown but official-sounding number asking me to confirm my address in relation to a neighbor dispute report filed earlier that morning, which meant Karen had already reached the sheriff's office, and they were now verifying the details, which made me exhale in frustration knowing that what should have been a peaceful morning had now transformed into another chapter of HOA-level chaos. But at least I had the truth on my side, and multiple witnesses, and clear footage of her using my driveway like it was a community park, and as I sat down on my porch step replaying the sprinkler moment on my phone mostly for amusement, I thought about how Karen never realized that her arrogance was always her downfall, because she could have apologized, she could have explained, she could have asked permission, but instead she created a carnival on my driveway before dawn and then acted shocked when consequences rained down literally, and now she was involving law enforcement, which meant the situation was about to escalate in ways even she did not anticipate, and as the sun rose higher warming the still wet pavement I knew the next phase of this saga was going to be bigger, louder, and far more dramatic, because Karen never loses calmly, she loses catastrophically, and with her driving straight to the sheriff, I had no doubt that Chapter 3 was only the calm before the next chaotic storm. When the sheriff finally arrived nearly an hour later, the neighborhood was already buzzing with the kind of quiet excitement people get when they know drama is about to unfold, and they want front-row seats without looking too obvious, and I had just finished moving the last of the broken tent poles to the side, when the patrol SUV pulled up slowly with its lights off, and out stepped Deputy Harris, a calm, level-headed man who had dealt with Karen more times than any law enforcement officer deserved. And the moment he approached my driveway, he took one look at the soaked decorations, the collapsed tent, the muddy footprints, and the sprinkler puddles, and sighed the kind of sigh that comes from a deep place of professional exhaustion, and he asked me with a weary voice, "All right, tell me what happened this time," and I explained everything from waking up to the tent blocking my driveway to Karen declaring community spirit law to the scheduled sprinklers doing what sprinklers have done every morning for years. And as I talked he nodded, occasionally glancing around and taking notes, and occasionally muttering, "I should have known she was involved before I even said her name," and right when I finished giving him the play-by-play, Karen came screeching back into the neighborhood in her minivan, slamming her brakes so hard the tires squealed, and she practically exploded out of the driver's seat, marching toward us with the fury of someone whose personal empire had toppled and soaked her in the process. And she pointed at me immediately, shouting, "There he is, officer, that man attacked my daughter's party and destroyed our belongings and traumatized my family," and she kept repeating traumatized like she had practiced it in the car, and Harris held up a hand calmly and asked her to slow down, but Karen never slows down, especially when she believes she is the hero of the situation, and she launched into a breathless monologue claiming that I was jealous of her daughter's beautiful party and used my sprinkler system as a weapon and intentionally drowned her decorations and caused her to slip on wet concrete and nearly break her back, and several neighbors snorted quietly at that because everyone saw her trip on her own robe, and she accused me of intentional water assault, which made Harris blink because even he had never heard that phrase before, and when he asked her why she built a tent on my property without permission, she snapped that the driveway was community territory and that the HOA president agreed, which made Harris glance at Mr. Dalton, who had just walked over, shaking his head, saying I absolutely did not agree to anything, and Karen spun around glaring at him, calling him unprofessional, unsupportive, and biased, claiming, "He always takes my side just because I maintain my property and bother no one," which made three neighbors choke on their coffee at once, and Harris rubbed the bridge of his nose and asked her point blank, "Did you or did you not hammer tent stakes into his lawn and block his driveway without authorization?" And the silence that followed was so thick it could have been sliced, because Karen tried to dodge the question, shifting her weight, sputtering that it was temporary and harmless and part of a community-building activity, and Harris finally asked me if I had any evidence, so I pulled out my phone and played the video of Karen marching around at dawn hammering metal stakes into my lawn while humming and waving her clipboard, and the deputy watched the Whole thing without saying a word, and Karen watched too, slowly shrinking into herself as the reality sank in that she had been recorded from the beginning, and when the clip ended she immediately launched a new excuse claiming that the footage was taken out of context and that she had verbal permission from me earlier in the week, which was a bold lie because I had barely spoken to her this month, and when Harris asked her for proof of this alleged permission she stuttered and then pointed at random neighbors demanding they confirm her story, but every single one of them either looked away or flatly said no. Karen, you never mentioned anything to us, and Mr. Willis added, I told you not to do it, but you said I don't care, it's happening anyway, and the more Karen tried to spin her version the deeper she dug herself, and finally Harris put his notebook away, and said, Karen, based on the evidence and witness statements you are the one trespassing and causing property damage, not him, and she let out a dramatic gasp, declaring this was injustice, harassment, discrimination against mothers, which made everyone look at each other confused, because no one knew what discrimination she was referring to, and she insisted that he fine me immediately for intentionally flooding her belongings, and Harris calmly reminded her that lawn sprinklers are allowed to run on private property, and that her unauthorized equipment was what got damaged, not anything I owned, and the realization slowly dawned on her that she had no leverage at all legally, socially, or even logically, because absolutely nothing in this situation favored her, and that was when she unleashed her last desperate tactic, which was to burst into fake tears, loudly claiming that her daughter would never forgive her for the ruined birthday, and that the entire neighborhood would know her family as the ones who had a failed party because of a cruel neighbor, and she pointed at me sobbing, you destroyed her special day, but even her tears looked forced because her mascara was already smeared from earlier and no one bought the performance, and Harris patiently told her that she could hold the party in her own yard, which was a perfectly reasonable solution she ignored from the start, and he warned her to remove all equipment from my property immediately or she could face citations for trespassing and property damage, and for a moment Karen just stood there trembling with rage, humiliation, and pure disbelief that the world was not bending in her favor, and then she suddenly spun around and marched toward the collapsed tent, barking orders at the kids and ordering them to help her lift what's left of the structure, even though it looked more like a soggy tarp now, and she kept muttering that this was not over and that she would not let her enemies win, which apparently included half the neighborhood, and as Harris stepped closer to me, he muttered in a low voice, good luck, she is definitely coming back with something worse, and I nodded. Because I already knew Karen well enough to understand she never stops at losing, she always prepares a counterstrike, and as I watched her dragging wet decorations and broken poles back toward her house, muttering like a villain plotting revenge, I had a sinking feeling that Chapter 4 was only the warm-up and the real storm was yet to come. By noon the neighborhood had returned to its usual rhythm, but everyone kept one eye toward Karen's house because whenever she suffered a public defeat she retreated only to re-emerge with some wild new plan fueled entirely by spite and denial, and I had just finished cleaning my driveway of soggy streamers when I saw her front door swing open with that familiar slam that always meant chaos was about to begin. Round 2, and sure enough there she was marching out with a clipboard, a pen, and that overly determined walk that made it look like she was about to rewrite the laws of the world through pure stubbornness, and behind her trailed her daughter looking sleepy, irritated, and totally uninterested in any birthday celebration, which made Karen's melodrama earlier even more ridiculous, and Karen immediately began pacing up and down the sidewalk loudly telling herself she needed signatures, witnesses, and community allies, and she repeated the words community allies several times like she was gathering troops for a battle instead of accepting the simple truth that she ruined her own party by trespassing onto my property, and as she muttered she began knocking on doors again, but this time, instead of begging for support, she tried threatening people by implying that anyone who refused to sign her statement would be considered complicit in my allegedly hostile sprinkler attack, and most neighbors simply closed the door in her face while others politely said they did not want to get involved, which only enraged her more because she needed anyone to affirm she was the victim and not the architect of her own disaster. And meanwhile, I tried not to get involved because honestly I wanted the day to go back to normal and focus on the work I was supposed to do, but peace was not something Karen allowed to exist for too long, and soon enough she made her way across the street, calling out loudly for everyone to gather because she was holding an emergency HOA assembly, which produced a collective groan from the few neighbors who heard her because HOA meetings were supposed to be scheduled formally, not created spontaneously out of one person's need for validation. But Karen did not care. She marched to the center of the cul-de-sac and planted herself there with her clipboard raised like she was about to make a revolutionary speech, and she began calling out names, reading from a list that seemed to be made up on the spot, and insisting that everyone needed to come witness the injustice being done to her family. And when no one came, she stomped her foot, cursed under her breath, and then declared that she would hold the meeting on her own lawn and issue a community letter to the HOA board, which was amusing because she was on the HOA board in the least important position, party coordination assistant, which was created only because she begged for a title and responsibilities and ended up annoying people so much that they restricted her duties to holiday decorations, which she still somehow managed to turn into conflicts over ribbon colors and wreath placement. And as she continued ranting, I went inside hoping that ignoring her would make her lose steam, but Karen is like a storm that grows stronger when ignored, and about 20 minutes later I heard loud scraping noises outside, and when I looked out the window I nearly choked on my drink, because Karen was dragging large folding tables from her garage down the sidewalk, leaving scratches on the pavement and setting them up directly in front of my driveway again, as if daring the universe to challenge her. And she placed a large hand-painted sign on one of them that read "Justice for Birthday Disaster," which looked more like a protest booth than anything remotely reasonable. And then she brought out 2 megaphones, even though she was the only one speaking, and she tested them by shouting into them so loudly that dogs 3 houses down began barking, and she yelled, "Attention neighbors," as if she were addressing a stadium, not an ordinary street, and she began reciting a speech she had clearly rehearsed about how I had orchestrated an attack on her daughter's happiness, used my sprinklers as a tactical weapon, and committed an act of emotional vandalism, which was such an odd phrase that I had to replay it in my head twice. And she even claimed that the sprinkler water contained harmful chemicals, which was impossible because it was the same basic municipal tap water everyone used. But Karen insisted that she smelled something unnatural in the water, and that this was obviously part of my plan to ruin her decorations and cause her to slip and nearly suffer a life-altering injury. And while she made these exaggerated claims, a small crowd began forming, but not in support, more like fascinated spectators observing a spectacle too strange to ignore, and people whispered to each other, comparing this meltdown to her past episodes like last year's Christmas lights incident or the infamous sidewalk chalk argument. And as I stepped outside to check what she was doing, Karen immediately swung the megaphone toward me and shouted, "There he is, the sprinkler attacker, the driveway tyrant," and she demanded that I come to her table and sign a confession admitting I was responsible for the ruin of her daughter's big day, and that I would pay full compensation for everything, including emotional damages and a spa voucher for her stress. And I stood there, staring at her because the entire scene was so absurd. It almost felt scripted, and I calmly told her to remove her table from my driveway again, and reminded her that the sheriff already explained she was the one trespassing and damaging property, and she screamed liar in a voice so shrill it echoed, and several neighbors covered their ears. And then she grabbed a stack of flyers she had made sometime between her morning tantrum, and now each titled "The Truth About the Sprinkler Attack" and featuring a badly edited picture of the collapsed tent with an arrow pointing at the sprinklers as if they were some criminal devices. And she began handing the flyers to confused neighbors while narrating her distorted version of events, which was filled with imaginary details like me laughing maniacally while pressing a hidden button to activate a secret sprinkler system mode, and her daughter crying on the sidewalk begging for mercy, none of which happened. And at one point she even claimed that the tent poles were electrified by the water, which caused her to fall, but everyone knew she slipped because her robe tangled around her own feet, and the more she spoke the more obvious it became that her goal was not justice at all but revenge mixed with public embarrassment for me, because she could not stand that her own poor decisions had been witnessed by half the neighborhood, and that the sheriff confirmed she was at fault, and when I refused to sign anything she accused me of being heartless, cruel, and anti-community, and she again repeated the non-existent community spirit doctrine, while shouting that the HOA would hear about this in an emergency vote, which made HOA President Dalton pinch the bridge of his nose like he was battling a migraine, and as Karen continued her theatrical speech, something unexpected happened. Her daughter tugged her sleeve and whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Mom, I don't even want the party anymore. Can we stop this and go inside?" And the entire cul-de-sac went silent for a moment, because that simple truth completely undercut Karen's crusade, and she froze mid-sentence, eyes wide, jaw hanging, as she tried to process that even her daughter had given up on the cause she was fighting so hard to inflate, and the embarrassment that flickered across her face was instant, but then hardened into renewed stubbornness as she snapped at her daughter, saying, "You don't understand, this is about principle." But the girl shook her head, rolled her eyes, and walked back inside alone, leaving Karen standing there looking more fragile and furious than ever. And I realized this battle was not ending soon, because Karen was losing allies fast, even inside her own home, and the more isolated she became, the more desperate and creatively chaotic her next move would be. The afternoon heat settled over the neighborhood like a heavy blanket, but instead of cooling down from the morning chaos, the tension only grew thicker, because Karen refused to let the situation die quietly, and after her daughter abandoned the cause and retreated indoors, she stood frozen for several seconds, staring at the closed door with a mixture of shock and betrayal, as if her own child had committed treason. And when she finally snapped out of it, she stormed back toward her makeshift protest table, kicking a deflated balloon out of her path, and muttering to herself about how no one appreciated her efforts or understood the importance of standing up for justice. And she grabbed her megaphone again, even though no one asked for another speech, and began shouting into it that she was officially launching a neighborhood petition to force a mandatory HOA vote against me for abuse of sprinkler systems, a phrase so bizarre it made even the squirrels pause and stare, and most neighbors did not even pretend to care anymore, because they had errands to run, children to manage, and normal lives to get back to. But Karen stood there alone, insisting that everyone was secretly supporting her, and that they were just too intimidated by me to show it, which was ridiculous, because half the neighborhood had already watched her slip, fall, scream, and fail multiple times today, and no one feared me. But she kept shouting her imaginary narrative into the megaphone until finally HOA President Dalton walked over, rubbing the side of his head like he had been fighting a migraine since dawn, and told her that she did not have the authority to call a vote without official documentation and board approval, which only made her angrier, because she interpreted this as him trying to suppress her voice rather than maintain basic HOA regulations. And in that moment something inside her snapped in a way that was louder than her megaphone, because she declared that if the HOA would not support her, then she would escalate the matter to county safety standards and environmental hazard regulators. And she pulled out her phone again and began dialing random offices, announcing loudly that she was reporting a dangerous water pressure hazard on private property, which made several neighbors exchange looks, because they knew this was the point where the situation was about to leave normal frustration territory and enter somewhere between comedy and disaster. And after a few minutes of her pacing and loudly explaining to someone on the phone that my sprinklers had launched water with the force of a fire hose and nearly sent her airborne, she hung up, triumphantly claiming the county would be sending someone to inspect the hazard, which I doubted. But with Karen you could never rule out her persistence, wearing down some poor receptionist and convincing them to file a complaint. And right when I thought she might run out of steam, she turned her attention back to me, marching across the street again with her wet sign flapping behind her like a sad banner, and she jabbed her finger toward my lawn demanding that I allow her to take water samples for evidence of contamination because she believed I had secretly installed a chemical additive capable of weakening tent poles and ruining birthday decorations, and I genuinely did not know whether to laugh or worry for her mental stability, and I calmly told her no, you are not stepping on my lawn again, and she yelled that I was obstructing a legal investigation, which made more neighbors peek through blinds trying not to laugh out loud, and when I refused again she spun around, stormed back to her driveway, and began rummaging through her garage until she emerged holding an old blue bucket, a tangled garden hose, and what looked like a pool testing kit, and she marched toward the sidewalk in front of my house, crouching dramatically with her bucket, as if she were conducting a NASA experiment, but she never dared step onto my grass because of the deputy warning earlier, so she crouched right at the property line, reaching the bucket out as far as she could, trying to catch leftover sprinkler water from the puddles, and she nearly toppled over 3 times while insisting loudly that she was gathering crucial evidence for the authorities, and when she finally managed to scoop a small amount of muddy water, she lifted it triumphantly like she had discovered a miracle mineral and declared that she now had proof of chemical interference, which was absurd because the water was nothing but dirt mixed with grass clippings and sunlight, but she carried the bucket back to her protest table like a prize and began using her pool testing strips, shouting out numbers and colors like they actually meant something, but all she discovered was that wet grass residue turns test strips funny colors, which she interpreted as toxic contamination, and she scribbled wildly on her clipboard, creating what she believed was a scientific report, and as she worked she muttered loudly about organizing a community safety inspection and possibly getting my water shut off until I apologized and paid her damages, all while her daughter watched from their window shaking her head like she had seen this meltdown pattern too many times to be shocked anymore. And by late afternoon Karen had built an entire fictional case file complete with the bucket of dirty water, 2 megaphones, 3 flyers, and 1 ruined sense of dignity, and she marched back toward me holding the bucket out as if she were presenting the Holy Grail, and announced that she was giving me one final chance to confess and compensate her before she submitted her findings to the authorities and unleashed a full investigation on my household. And I looked into the bucket at the sad murky mess inside and asked her how exactly this proved anything, and she replied that she had watched enough crime documentaries to know contamination when she saw it, and that water is never muddy unless sabotage is involved. And I pointed out that she had scraped the bucket across dirt while scooping the water, but she waved this off, insisting that real investigators would know how to interpret the sample properly, and that I was trying to intimidate her with science, which made absolutely no sense. But Karen said it with such confidence, it almost felt illegal to question her logic, and when I again told her she had no case, she slammed the bucket down on her table, splashing herself in the legs again and shouting, "Fine then, I hope you're ready, because after today everyone will know what you did," and she stormed back toward her house, leaving a trail of muddy droplets, and muttering about emergency board meetings, legal representation, and scientific findings, and as she slammed the door behind her the entire neighborhood exhaled in shared relief and mild dread, because whenever Karen retreated indoors it meant she was preparing something bigger, something louder, and something guaranteed to turn the peaceful evening into round 3 of chaos. And I had a sinking feeling that whatever she was planning next would make the morning tent collapse look like a warm-up act. Evening crept over the neighborhood with that calm orange glow that usually signals the end of a peaceful day. But nothing about this day had been peaceful, and the quiet only made everyone more anxious, because whenever Karen disappeared inside her house for more than an hour she came back with something new, unhinged, outrageous, or catastrophically illogical, and sure enough, as the sun dipped lower her front door slammed open so loudly that 2 dogs down the street started barking, and Karen emerged wearing a blazer over her pajamas, holding a giant binder stuffed with papers and sticky notes like she was about to present a case before the Supreme Court, and she marched straight into the middle of the street, planting herself like a general preparing to announce a battle plan, and she raised a whistle to her mouth and blew it so sharply that the sound echoed through the cul-de-sac, sending a flock of birds scattering from a nearby tree, and within seconds neighbors stepped out of their homes not because they wanted to support her but because they feared what chaos would unfold if no one monitored her, and Karen seized the moment by shouting, "Attention, everyone, I hereby call an emergency HOA tribunal," which was ridiculous because she did not have the authority to call anything resembling a tribunal, but she was too far gone in her own dramatic spiral to care, and she opened her binder, flipping through pages until she found one covered in highlighted text and began reading some official-sounding nonsense about community obligations, property attacks, and sprinkler misuse, which she claimed fell under hostile environmental practices, and she pointed at me proudly proclaiming that she had gathered evidence, witness statements, photographic proof, and scientific results proving I had intentionally launched a coordinated water assault on her daughter's birthday celebration, and she held up the bucket of murky water as if it were the final piece of evidence that would seal her victory, and the neighbors looked at each other with expressions that hovered between disbelief and amusement because they had seen the entire saga unfold, and no one was buying her manufactured narrative, but Karen was powering through her script, flipping pages as if she were presenting volumes of legal codes, and she dramatically pointed toward her house, shouting that her daughter was emotionally devastated, hiding in her room and refusing to eat anything but a slice of plain bread because of the trauma, which was quickly disproven when her daughter opened the door behind her holding a large bag of chips and loudly asked, "Mom, can you stop this please?" And Karen whipped around, shushing her in humiliation before continuing her speech about psychological damage caused by moist environments, which made absolutely no sense, but she read it with such flair it almost sounded legitimate until she mispronounced half the words and lost her place 3 times, flipping pages frantically, and then she switched tactics, claiming the sprinkler water contained harmful elements including dirt, bacteria, and traces of suspicious substances, which she said she had detected using her advanced at-home testing kit, meaning the cheap pool strips she used earlier. And HOA President Dalton finally stepped forward, rubbing his temples like he had aged a decade since morning, and he politely asked Karen to stop, because none of this was within HOA jurisdiction and her claims had no basis in any rules, regulations, or reality. But Karen gasped dramatically, calling him biased, incompetent, and possibly complicit in a cover-up, and she pointed at the neighbors angrily, accusing them of being silent supporters of my actions, and demanded that they vote right there right now on whether I should be fined and censured for sprinkler misuse and property hostility. And when no one raised their hands, she blew her whistle again and claimed that intimidation was preventing them from voting freely, which caused several people to burst into laughter because the only intimidating force on the street was her lung power through that whistle. And then Karen tried her boldest move yet. She announced that she had already contacted a local news tip line and told them a shocking story about an abusive neighbor launching a high-pressure water attack on a child's birthday tent, and that the news team might arrive any moment to cover the unfolding scandal. And everyone froze for a moment, imagining the horrifying possibility of Karen giving a chaotic interview on camera. But before panic could set in, Karen pulled out her phone, waving it like a trophy as she showed an email confirmation that someone from the station received her message and was reviewing it, and no one knew whether the station would actually send a crew, but the threat alone was enough to make people step closer just to prevent her from destroying the neighborhood reputation on live TV. And as she continued her theatrical speech, she suddenly switched gears, accusing me of running an illegal sprinkler pressure modification operation, claiming that no normal sprinkler could knock over a tent of that size, and that I must have installed military-grade water pressure boosters, which nearly made me choke on my drink, because she was describing a sprinkler system like it was a missile launcher. And when I calmly told her that the sprinklers had been installed years before I even moved in and were on the original automated schedule, she shouted liar and flipped through her binder, searching for a page labeled Timeline of Suspicious Sprinkler Behavior, which was filled with handwritten accusations about water rates, humidity patterns, and how my lawn looked too green this year, suggesting foul play. And the neighbors stared at the page, struggling not to laugh, as she insisted this was compelling evidence of villainous hydrating practices. And the moment reached peak absurdity when she banged her binder closed and declared that she was placing me under temporary neighborhood sanction, which was not a real thing, but she said it with such confidence that she actually paused waiting for applause, but instead the silence was broken by the sound of a sheriff SUV turning into the cul-de-sac, and as soon as Karen saw it she straightened her posture, smoothed her hair, and clutched her binder like she was about to present the case of the century, and out stepped Deputy Harris again, looking even more tired than before, and he approached slowly, asking what exactly was happening now, and Karen rushed to him, launching into her dramatic speech about evidence contamination, trauma, negligence, sprinkler abuse, and community endangerment, waving the bucket in his face so aggressively that some of the dirty water splashed onto his boots, and Harris stared at her, then stared at the bucket, then stared at the neighbors, who were shaking their heads, silently signaling no, do not believe a single word of this, and he finally asked her to start from the beginning, and when she proudly presented her binder, he opened it, flipped through 2 pages, saw nothing but nonsense and sticky notes, and closed it again in under 5 seconds, telling her there was absolutely no legal grounds for any complaint she filed today, and that if she continued harassing neighbors or filing false reports she could face actual consequences, and Karen froze like a statue, her mouth hanging open, as she tried to process that her grand tribunal fantasy had not only failed but backfired, and Harris told her in a calm but firm voice to pack up her table, remove all items from the street, and go inside for the rest of the night, before she created further disturbances, and she sputtered, attempting to protest, but even she knew she had lost every remaining scrap of credibility, and as she dragged her table back toward her driveway, defeated and furious, the neighbors quietly dispersed, leaving her to mutter threats and excuses under her breath, and as the sun fully set I realized that the storm of chaos she had unleashed all day might finally be nearing its end, but I also knew Karen well enough to sense something else simmering beneath her frustration, because she never accepts defeat gracefully, and tomorrow would bring either an apology or another explosion, and knowing Karen, an apology was the least likely option of all. By the next morning the neighborhood felt strangely calm, like the air itself was resting after surviving the emotional hurricane Karen had unleashed the previous day, and I woke up half expecting to find another tent, another protest booth, or Karen pacing the sidewalk with a bullhorn shouting about sprinkler crimes, but instead there was only quiet sunlight and the usual birdsong, which almost made me suspicious, because silence around here usually meant she was plotting something out of sight. And as I stepped outside to check the driveway, the memories of yesterday felt unreal, like a chaotic fever dream involving collapsing tents, rogue sprinklers, malfunctioning megaphones, and one very determined woman holding a bucket of muddy water like it was a sacred relic. And while I inspected the lawn to ensure nothing new had been staked into it, I noticed something that made me pause, because across the street Karen was standing on her porch, but not in the dramatic battle-ready stance she usually adopted. Instead, she looked oddly still, almost deflated, as if the previous day's events had finally caught up to her, and she was holding a piece of paper, staring at it with an expression that was not anger but something closer to resignation, and for a moment she did not notice me, but when she finally did she hesitated, then started walking across the street with none of the exaggerated confidence she normally displayed, and as she approached I braced myself for another tirade, some twisted accusation or another bizarre theory about sprinkler physics, but instead she stopped a few feet away, cleared her throat, and in a voice far quieter than I had ever heard said, "I suppose I owe you an apology," which nearly made me fall through the concrete, because in all the years I had known her I had never heard the word apology leave her mouth, not even once, and she glanced down at the paper again, then at me, as if forcing herself to continue, admitting that the sheriff had spoken with her later in the evening about filing false reports and misusing emergency contacts, and that she could face actual charges if she escalated things further, and I could see the embarrassment on her face, not the theatrical kind she used to manipulate people, but genuine discomfort, as she admitted she had acted impulsively, emotionally, and without thinking things through, and she said the sprinkler incident had shocked her more than she wanted to admit, and that after the tent collapsed she panicked because she wanted her daughter's birthday to be perfect after a difficult year, and instead everything she touched fell apart, including her own sense of control, and as I listened I realized that beneath all the theatrics noise and chaos there was still a real person buried under layers of entitlement and dramatics, someone who genuinely struggled with feeling judged or inadequate. And when she said that her daughter had cried not because of the sprinklers, but because she was embarrassed by her mother's behavior, it finally seemed to break through whatever distorted lens she usually saw the world through, and she admitted she spent the evening thinking about how she could salvage things, but the more she replayed the day the more she realized she had created every problem herself, from trespassing onto my property to refusing to move the tent to fabricating conspiracies about water pressure and harmful chemicals. And when she finished she held out the paper, which turned out to be an official notice from the HOA board temporarily suspending her from any event planning duties, and requiring her to attend a conflict resolution meeting before she could participate again, which must have stung deeply because event planning was the one thing she loved despite being terrible at it, and she said she knew the whole neighborhood was tired of her causing scenes, and that maybe she needed to take a step back before she damaged her relationship completely. And for the first time in a long time her voice trembled, not with rage but with something close to humility, and I accepted the apology because holding on to the chaos would only prolong the tension, and honestly seeing her acknowledge her own behavior was more surprising and satisfying than any revenge could have been. And she nodded quietly before turning to leave, but then she stopped and said she had organized a small replacement birthday gathering for her daughter in their backyard with no tents, no megaphones, and no borrowed equipment, and she asked if it would be all right if I came by later, not as a gesture of guilt, but because her daughter had asked if the neighbors could come to make it feel normal, and I agreed, and watched her return to her house with a slower, calmer walk than usual. And later that afternoon several neighbors gathered in her backyard for a simple small celebration with cupcakes, music from a normal speaker, and a very relaxed atmosphere, and her daughter seemed genuinely happy surrounded by friends and neighbors, while Karen stayed mostly in the background offering drinks quietly and avoiding any dramatic flair, which was honestly refreshing. And as the sun set the group joked lightly about the infamous sprinkler incident, but even Karen managed a small laugh at herself, shaking her head at how wildly she had behaved, and in that moment the entire neighborhood seemed to exhale the last remnants of tension left from the day before, realizing that sometimes even the loudest storms eventually pass and leave behind a clearer sky. And as I walked home that evening I looked at my sprinklers sitting peacefully in the lawn, and could not help laughing at how something so ordinary had triggered an entire saga, and somehow also resolved it. And from that day on Karen was noticeably calmer, less reactive, and far more respectful of boundaries, and while she occasionally slipped back into old habits, she never again tried to plant anything on my property or set up unauthorized tents. And whenever she passed by my driveway she would glance at the sprinklers and smirk, like she had learned a lesson that nature had delivered better than any argument. And the neighborhood slowly returned to normal harmony, with only the occasional joke about rainstorms and tent collapses. And as for me, I realized that sometimes karma arrives not with anger or force, but with perfectly timed water pressure and the patience to let the universe handle the rest.